So, guys, welcome wherever you're listening, however you're listening, and welcome to TAP, otherwise known as the Alphabet Podcast, with me, your host, Leanna Divine. Now, hopefully, by now, you'd have listened to a few episodes on attachment and anxiety, boundaries, being Black and British, and just the predecessor to this one, COVID. So, I'm going to jump straight in. It's a term that I introduced towards the end of my podcast on COVID, and it's a term called complex grief or complicated grief. And for those of you who haven't listened to COVID, feel free to go back and give it a listen, because it's where this term first became really apparent in my mind. Complex grief is something that I've known about for a while, not necessarily as a therapist, but just through my own personal experiences of grief and certain family situations that I've encountered over the last few years. But it's something that I see more and more. I think as a therapist, it's probably the main reason why people come to therapy. It shows up in different ways. So it's not just, I did say it on the last podcast, but grief is not just death. It involves any type of loss. So people tend to associate grief with loss, and bereavement is a major type of loss, and we will get into that. But anything that you're attached to that you lose, you usually go through a period of mourning. Now, for the purpose of clarification, in medical terminology, complex grief will usually be diagnosed after 6 months. So you're expected to be able to grieve for up to about 6 months. And then after that, it becomes more of a disorder. And it's something that, is impacting your life. And you may at this stage go and see a GP. So I did clear that up on the last podcast, but I think it's important for clarity that we revisit certain points. So for me, like I've said, it's one of the biggest reasons that people come to therapy. And I think after COVID, which, had an impact on a lot of people in a lot of ways, I see more and more, a lot of people suffering from complicated grief. And for the most part, not really even being aware. So I don't know if you've sensed it amongst your circle of people that you love or your friends, just that sense of people generally not being okay, but not really being able to put your finger on what it is and what's changed and what potentially they may be going through. So by the end of the podcast, I think it would be good for us to know a bit more about complex grief, like what it looks like, so that you're able to recognize it in yourself and other people, because not everything that you hear on this podcast will relate to you. But in a lot of instances, it may relate to a loved one. So if it's not you, it could be affecting someone else that you care about. I'm also going to look quite a bit on the relationship between endings and complex grief. So by the end of the podcast, hopefully the listeners will be able to explore a bit more their own relationship with endings. And hopefully, because we don't just like to present the problems, we like to put forward some solutions. So start to heal from your complex grief and live a more fulfilled life. So with that, we'll just get started on the segment on complex grief. Now, grief is something that, like I've kind of mentioned just in the introduction, for most people, when people think of grief, they think of death, being bereaved, losing a loved one, maybe extended to like losing a pet, but usually the death of a loved one or a beloved pet or something similar. It's important to really stipulate that anything that you're attached to that you lose, a period of grief could follow, and that can look different for a lot of people. But in general, psychologists, therapists, and just some people that like to look into things rely on, not totally, but they use as a guide the stages of grief. And it's been highlighted in this particular model, 5 stages of grief. And for the purpose of those who haven't listened to the previous podcast, I just want to highlight that not everybody will go through these 5 stages of grief. Some people will go through some of them and skip others. And it's also possible to revisit stages of grief. And I would suggest that in something like complex grief, where this period of mourning lasts for a longer period, there will be quite a bit of revisiting of these stages. So you can look at it and it may come out in different orders, but the order that I like to go through is like the first stage would be like a stage of denial. Now, denial is a common defense mechanism. And by defense mechanism, I just mean a process that we all rely on psychologically. So sometimes we tell ourselves different stories or deny certain aspects just for the purpose of self-preservation, maybe. Maybe it could be that we need to deny a situation, but we all use defense mechanisms to some degree or other. But where it affects your mental health is if you rely very heavily on these defense mechanisms and to the point where you're not necessarily even aware that you're using them. So they do operate on an unconscious level. So that means that you're not aware, but they also operate on a conscious level. So you are aware that you're using them sometimes. But I would suggest the more unaware you are, the probably more unhealthy your reliance on that particular defense mechanism is. So with something like denial, it's probably, I deny to myself how many grey hairs I have. I'm in denial about that. But for example, if I was in denial about drinking 3 bottles of wine every night, that would be a bit more harmful. So for those reasons, you tend to find denial in things like addiction. So there's a lot of denial as a defense mechanism involved in addiction, but equally in grief. It's a very painful process to lose something or someone that you love, whether it be to death or just not being in your life anymore, or whether it be a home or anything that you're attached to, you lose it. It might be possible for you to understand why you want to be in denial. It's very difficult and you'd want to protect yourself psychologically from harm. So remember, that's the reason why we use defense mechanisms. So denial will be very common, but with grief, when it usually plays out in a healthy way, at this stage, you probably wouldn't stay in very long. So it might be useful while you're still trying to plan things like the funeral. But if 6 to 12 months, 2 years later, you're still in denial that your loved one's gone, you may have an issue with complex grief. The next stage that is highlighted a lot, and probably a lot of people can recognize when you've lost something or someone that you love, feeling angry. I did it with COVID as well, the denial, this is not happening. And then the anger. Why is this happening? Do you know what I mean? Why is this happening to me? Why have I lost my loved one? Why have I lost this relationship? Why have I lost my home? Why have I lost my job? That anger. So remember, grief is not just death, it's the loss of other things. So that feeling of anger. And with something like complex grief, you'd expect to see that anger revisited time and time again. So, that anger is something that you find in stages of grief. I mentioned briefly the bargaining stage, and that being a very personal thing. So you may not necessarily know what other people bargain for, but it is common in grief for people to just say, I'll give anything just for my loved one to be back. I'll be good if you can just bring my loved one back, or if they would just not be terminally ill. Because even things like terminal illness involve complex grief. So, grief why people are still alive. So you have that bargaining. I mentioned an example with COVID, me bargaining that they would change the law so that I could have 30 people instead of 60 at my birthday celebration. Okay, so the next stage of grief, there tends to be a depression phase, and totally understandable. You lose something, you become numb. You have that numbness, that feeling of nothingness, maybe not wanting to do stuff. So there you can understand that depression phase. That might be the first kind of example where you can see how depression and complicated grief could look similar. If someone is numb and they're feeling that quite often, you could mistake that for being depression. And then an acceptance phase that usually comes at the end. I mean, nobody wants to accept that their loved one is no longer here, or that relationship that they valued so much is over. But for most people, we get to that stage eventually and we're able to move on. It's difficult, but we're able to do it. So why is it that some people, these stages and seem to be okay, and other people tend to get stuck and revisit these different stages? So we'll have a look at that in a little while. But one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast, I call complex grief the misdiagnosis of the human condition. And the human condition that I'm referring to is grief. Anyone that's ever lost anything or anyone that they love will know that grief is the price that we pay for love. But, what I find in my own experience of complicated grief, and for me, initially, I believed it started in about 2017, because that was the time I first presented myself to my GP. By that point, I'd lost 3 family members in the space of a year. And I was, for want of a better term, I was really struggling. I was still trying to maintain my job. I was still trying to maintain all the other hats that I had to work with. And for the most part, I was doing it, but I was really struggling. And literally, I just wanted some time off work. I wanted to be paid. So I went to the doctor and tried to get a sick note. Now, the doctor asked me some questions and asking me, was I eating and was I sleeping? And I wasn't really sleeping too well, and I wasn't eating very well. Asked me, strangely enough, something about my sex drive, which wasn't particularly high at that time. As you can imagine, I just lost 3 significant family members. And to be fair, I wasn't in a relationship anyway. I'd also lost a relationship in between that time. So you can see how complex grief works. It's not just the death of a loved one. It could be the loss of a loved one as well. So if you're having these losses on top of each other, you can see how it's going to have a greater effect. So this GP listened to me and then quite quickly diagnosed me with depression. And I was like totally flabbergasted because for me, my mental health had always been fine. Like it's not something I'd ever worried about. I've never worried about being depressed or anything like that. And I was very well aware that the situation that I was going through was quite unique. It's not very often that you lose three close family members in such a short space of time. So you can expect that there would be some sadness and some withdrawing and not eating and sleeping. For the GP to then offer me antidepressants and tell me to take it and advise me to have people observe me to make sure that I didn't have suicidal thoughts, I was just totally flabbergasted. And I went away and I didn't take the antidepressants. To this day, I reject the diagnosis. It's never something that's been brought up again. But it made me wonder, now that I've become a therapist, how many people that is their experience. Because as we know, there's a lot of people that in this country that are diagnosed with depression, and probably a lot of them do have depression. And complicated grief can be a factor in depression, but depression is not just one thing. So you could expect that a person that has depression may have aspects of complicated grief, but the two are not exactly the same. You can have complicated grief without being depressed. And I felt if my GP had just asked me more specific questions, such as, has there been any like recent losses? What's your experience of loss? Like, how are you dealing with the loss of your loved ones? Very quickly, he would have realized that it wasn't depression and it was more complicated grief, because my feelings of guilt and feeling low mood were all to do with these three particular people. It wasn't to do with life in general. I hadn't lost my zest for life. I was just really sad about the loss of these three significant people. So that's the first thing that I will say. Depression is a mental illness, and it's not just one thing. Whereas complicated grief tends to be as a result specifically of grief or loss. So in some ways it will look the same. The feeling stuck, the not coping with life, maybe feeling withdrawn socially, but it would look a bit different. Whereas with depression, you'd expect a person to be avoiding social things altogether. With someone that's going through complicated grief, it may just be things that are reminders of their loved ones or what they've lost. So they avoid those specific things. And suicidal thoughts, then a depressed person and someone with complicated grief may both have suicidal thoughts. But where one is just like a general feeling of not being worthy and literally being in too much pain to live, with someone that's going through complicated grief, it could just be a wish simply to be reunited with their loved one, which is very different, so there are things that look the same, but there's no pill that you can take to stop you from missing someone. So, the treatment for depression wouldn't be particularly effective for someone that's going through complicated grief. So if you're someone that thinks that you may be suffering from complicated grief, not depression, and maybe you've been taking medication for depression for a long time and having no effect, may well be that it's not depression that you have, even though the two can look very similar. But whereas depression would be ruminating in general about negative things, I would expect complicated grief to be about specific things. So whether it be that loved one or that loss of a relationship or that loss of a job, I'd expect it to come in waves. And a core symptom that complicated grief has that depression doesn't have is that intense longing for either the deceased person or the lost person. You wouldn't expect to find that in depression. Also, something that I find what makes me worry about people in general these days is that a lot of people are desensitized. So I think that's a bit different to feeling numb. Desensitized seems closer to being dissociated. Like people are just genuinely so traumatized and having one layer of trauma put on top of another that they don't seem to be affected by things in the way that they should. So if you're someone that's worried about feeling like that way, desensitized, it could also be that you're suffering from complicated grief. So I can totally understand to a certain degree why GPs, you have very little time to ask the questions, would on the surface of things think, all right, this is depression, and go down the route. I do mention CBT a lot, and just to clarify, that's cognitive behavioral therapy, and that will change your patterns of unhelpful thoughts, which is very useful for depression. But complicated grief, like I say, is a human condition, and depending on what kind of experiences and what losses you've had, that is going to dictate how you react to grief. So with that being said, let's kind of just jump straight in and have a look at the risk factors, or who is more likely to be affected by this complicated grief. So if we look at death first, because bereavement and death is a big part of complicated grief, we can look at things like how the person died. That's going to be important. Was it sudden? Was it traumatic? Like I mentioned, I thought that my first experience of complicated grief came in about 2017 when I'd lost these three family members. But actually, once I'd been to therapy and spoke about these losses in therapy, very quickly, my therapist helped me to see that actually my relationship with loss and complicated grief started when I was 9 years old, when I lost my dad in very traumatic circumstances. He was murdered and leaving me and my three sisters, my younger sisters at the time. So my first experience of loss was the murder of my father. So even though all these years had been in between, it's funny what the brain does. It connects it. And just the experience I had at that time, all of the adults around me were very stoic and wanted to put on a brave face for the children. So that kind of affects how you learn to grieve. So maybe that's something for adults to think about when kids maybe lost parents, letting them see you upset so that they then have that permission to grieve themselves. Because without having a handbook on grief, it's difficult to know what to do. But I often think that the way I react to grief and attempting to be stoic all the time actually affects the way I actually deal with grief in the long run, if that makes sense. So, whether, your relationship with the person who died, what was your relationship like with the person who died? Were you cut off from them? Was there any conflict? Because family conflict often plays out and makes the process of grief a lot more complicated. All ramblings over money and estates and property and who gets what and who loves this person more, who's the favorite, were there conflicts? I've mentioned already death and abandonment at a young age. So I mentioned it in the attachment podcast. If your dad was Mr. Johnson and he left, or like in my situation, your parent died, your relationship with loss and abandonment is going to look a lot different. Children tend to internalize things like that. So being a parent walking out or leaving through death, which is not their choice, a lot of negative feelings come up like loneliness, abandonment, rejection. A lot of these negative feelings come up for children. So whether or not you have mental health conditions, because that will affect the way you deal with grief. You don't necessarily have the same capacity to understand certain concepts, and that will block your progress through the stages. You might have a mental health condition where denial is a big thing, or anger is a big thing, or it may be that you're so depressed that you can't even feel the pain of losing a loved one. So if you have mental health conditions, you would expect your risk factor for a complicated grief to be higher. Also a history of trauma, and that's a big one because so many people these days have, we'll talk about it more when we get to depression, so many things in their backpack, all this history of traumatic things and adding one thing on top of another on top of another. And especially if these individual aspects have not been worked through or dealt with, it's just going to be like layers and layers of trauma. So now, what is your relationship with loss like? How do you deal with loss? Do you see loss as a positive thing or a negative thing? Do you internalize it or externalize it? All of these things play into it. So, it's quite a lot to think about. So we're just going to take a break for a few moments and then we're going to jump straight back in. Now, something that I may appear to have missed out, but something that I'm going to emphasize here now, another situation where a big risk factor in complex grief is the loss of a child. Now, on the second half of this podcast, I've got a very special guest, a good friend of mine, Rachel Webb, whose son Kyron was very sadly murdered, age 15, on the streets of Manchester. She documents through a period of writing into a journal, a diary, her experience of dealing with complex grief. And it's something that I will play in full on the next podcast. So for those of you who feel strong enough to listen to Rachel's story, I hope that it will bring some hope. It is a very sad story, but it's also a story of a lot of hope and inspiration. So as you can imagine, the loss of a child would make the process of grief a lot more difficult. There'd be periods of denial. There'd be a lot of anger. And how do you get to acceptance about the loss of a child? Because it does defy the natural order of things. And for a lot of women, that is their reality. They've had to deal with losing children. And how does that impact on their mental health? Black children are more likely to be murdered. Is it something that as a community we need to kind of look at more? Because it's not just the impact of losing these young people, which is in itself is sad enough, but it's the impact on those that are left behind. So it's something that we will look at, and it is a very sad thing, but we need to look at complex grief because it's affecting a lot of people in a lot of ways. So we've looked at quite a lot at death because bereavement is a big aspect of complex grief. But I mentioned at the beginning that by the end of the podcast, I would like for the listeners to understand the relationship with endings and complex grief, because we all have a relationship with endings. And there's so many different types of endings. There's the sudden ending, there's the planned endings, the foreseen ones, the drawn out, the painful. And there's different situations in life where we have endings. So we've spoken a lot about one type of ending, bereavement, which is very final, but it's not the only type of loss that you can experience. So relationships are a big part of what we're all about. And people lose relationships quite a lot during COVID on a day-to-day, and that can be separation or divorce. So think about the knock-on effects of that, because a lot of the time when people, that live together and have children together are invested, there's a loss of a relationship that may have the knock-on effect of losing a home, being separated from children, maybe a splitting of the friendship group, difficulties with finance. And we already know that this contributes to male mental health, being separated from their children, and financial implications and risk factors for suicide. So there's different types of things. And if you're having to deal with bereavement and issues with your relationship at the same time, because a lot of the time when someone dies, there's financial implications, you can see how one layer adds on to another. Another important type of relationship that often gets understated is friendships. In this day and age, we're all learning a lot more about boundaries. And I'll speak quite openly, in my kind of quest to get better boundaries, I've lost quite a lot of friends. And it may seem like you're losing these friends for a positive reason. You're trying to improve your life, but the knock-on effect is you care for these people and you're attached to these people. And there's a process of grief when you lose a friendship. So that can't be understated. Friendships are very important to our mental health. And if we're losing these friendships, or we're losing touch, or we're moving away, different reasons why these friendships are separated, it can have an effect on our mental health. I've spoken a lot on the last podcast about the long COVID and the impact that can have on people's mental health. And it's that whole loss of ability, you not being able to do things that you used to be able to do. And that can be through injury. Professional athletes, a lot of them, when they go through serious injury, they have a loss of ability. They lose that sense of self as well in amongst that. So that's the type of ending for them. And even carers and people that care for people that are long-term ill or possibly terminally ill. How does that impact the process of complex grief? It's a very drawn-out type of ending. I mentioned different type of endings: sudden, planned, foreseen, fragmented. It's very drawn out and painful, seeing a loved one deteriorate before eventually passing on. A lot of people, sometimes they lose their mental capabilities and you lose that person before they die physically. So how does that impact on complex grief? Things like moving home. Sometimes for reasons that we can't control, we have to move. Maybe even if it's planned, that can have an impact on you. That's a type of ending, type of grief process potentially. What about moving to or from another country? This is happening a lot with the refugees and stuff. How does that impact on your mental health? It's a type of ending, moving from one place to another. Big one for children, starting school, like secondary school. Even young adults leaving home to go to university. These are all types of situations in life where endings can come into play, and therefore grief, because there's a kind of loss, changes in work. So some of us are lucky enough to get to the stage where we may be close to retirement, I wish, but for a lot of people, retirement is something they look forward to, but there's also that loss of identity. If you've been working for 40, 50 years and a lot of your identity is tied up in your work, how does that impact you? That's a type of ending. Losing your career, what kind of effect does that have on your mental health? So there's different types of endings. During COVID, a lot of people lost jobs altogether. Things like life cycle for women, just the ending of a certain biological things and the start of different processes. How does that impact people's mental health? And we spoke about it with COVID again, the loss of freedom. How does that impact? That's a type of ending. Loss of self. So your relationship with endings is going to determine how you deal with all of these different life situations where endings come into play. Equally, your attachment style. So we mentioned secure children in the first podcast, tend to have a more positive worldview. So it's not that they grieve less, it's just that they're more equipped to deal with a natural process like grief because they have a more positive worldview and potentially trust that things will be okay. But if you have a more insecure attachment, which 50% of us do, or at least 50%, what's your pattern of behaving when it comes to endings or loss? Do you cut off emotionally, or do you avoid things? Do you distance yourself? As I would expect, avoidant people. Are you in denial? So, will you be the kind of person that's maybe depending on drinking drugs or, clinging on to avoid having to end altogether? So what's your relationship like with endings? And that's something as adults that we can do the work on. We can look at this because it's something that we can go back and look at. We can think about the endings that we've had in our lives and what kind of feelings come up for us when we think about endings. Are we seeing endings as transitions, potentially new beginnings? Or are we taking all the negative things away from it? Because that's something that we can look at, because endings can be beautiful and the beginning of something even better. How did you learn to deal with loss? I mentioned it briefly in my own story of seeing the adults being stoic. As adults, are we showing our children the right example in terms of how to deal with endings, to grieve appropriately, but then to have things and strategies to be able to move on? And, maybe not necessarily having a time period and opening up the floor for them to talk about their feelings to do with loss and endings, so that it's not something that's not spoke about. So it's not something that becomes repressed or denied later on. So how do you manage endings? When endings are lost, I'm using the two things interchangeably, but how do you deal with loss? Do you deal with it in a helpful way or an unhelpful way? I know when I was going through that period I spoke about in 2017, there was a lot of Gavoisier being drunk. But obviously that's not sustainable. It's a very unhelpful way of repressing your feelings or denying your feelings and not necessarily dealing with the emotions at hand. It'll also increase your anger, and it'll definitely stop you from accepting, and it'll also bring the depression, because things like alcohol are also depressants. So, when you stop drinking alcohol, the chances are you will feel worse. Some people, they have a loss or someone dies or a relationship breaks up, and they start going to the gym, they cut their hair, they have a new outlook and try to be positive and look at all the things they want to connect with, all the things they want to change. And for some people, it feels like the end of the world, because they might be so tied up in this other person that the idea of being without them is not possible. So there's things you can do. You can look at what type of feelings do come up for you with endings. Are you someone that just goes straight to feeling loss or despair or guilt or resentment? Is that how you feel when relationships break up? Do you feel abandoned and isolated? Does it cause you anxiety so that you just cling on? Or are you one of these people that actually feel relief sometimes when things come to an end, or feel happiness or excited or hopeful? Because we should be hopeful about new beginning. So it really just depends on the relationship that you have with endings, and that tends to be rooted in your past. So if you want to look at how you deal with loss and grief, and why you're probably suffering from complicated grief, and that's explaining why somebody else isn't, the answers may well be in your past. So you have to look at all of these different factors when you're looking at complicated grief, because grief is a very personal process and it's very different for everyone. So I kind of hope we could look so much more. I may even do a segment on endings, because endings is such an important aspect. And I think it's something that people overlook a lot of the time, how you deal with endings and how you deal with new beginnings. Because ultimately, that's what comes from endings. It's very important for your mental health. So just take all of that in, and I'll be back on the other side just to summarize the things that we can do with complicated grief in terms of both death and, if it's other aspects like endings and relationships, what we can do to help ourselves, because we want to try and be our own therapist and identify the areas that we need to work on so that we can become a stronger, more fulfilled individual. So I will be back in a few moments just to have a look at what we can do. Cool. Okay, so even though it's not been a particularly long podcast, it's covered quite a lot of things, which sometimes is a bit inevitable. So I haven't been able to necessarily go into as much detail with everything that I would have liked to have covered. I think it's important that at the end of every podcast, we don't just, I keep speaking in this third person, that I don't just keep highlighting the issues. I think a lot of people are aware, even if they can't put a name to it, that complicated grief is an issue. Because like I said at the very beginning, whether it's to do with loss of loved ones or loss of self or loss of relationships is one of the biggest reasons why people come to therapy. There will be some complex grief somewhere at some point in the chain of events. So what are the things that we can do or look out for? So I think this podcast may have helped, but just understanding the grief process a bit more. So we spoke about the 5 stages there, but also understanding that not all of us will go through those stages, and also that we can revisit these stages at any time. So grief comes in waves. So it's important that we have self-compassion. So whether we're grieving the death of a loved one, a pet, a relationship, whatever it is that we've lost and we're grieving for, to have self-compassion. As with anything that kind of may affect you mentally, it's important to look after your physical health. So make sure you're eating right, sleeping right. Just by simply maintaining your physical health, you can ensure that your poor mental health doesn't stray into being mental illness. So it becomes mental illness when it's impacting you on a daily basis. And with complicated grief, it's more than 6 months. Keep a steady routine. So whether it's the complicated grief of losing a loved one or relationship, keeping a steady routine will give you less time to ruminate on some of the negative aspects that kind of keep you stuck and probably stop you from accepting. If you've got this steady routine, you're going through the motions and giving yourself less time to dwell If you've lost a loved one, especially helpful for children. I've been watching EastEnders like a lot of the population recently, and I've seen what's happened with Lola and Lexi. And a memory box is something that's very helpful. So simply having a memory box filled with good memories of your loved one, it can be particularly useful for children, but also for adults. Make sure you put a lot of good memories in there. And when you're feeling particularly low, you can go and have a look at that memory box. It's also important to remember to take each day at a time. Every day is going to look different. You cannot look too far ahead. And it's the same with life. I think we become more anxious and more stressed when we look too far ahead. Okay, simply just dealing with what we have in front of us and being present, taking each day at a time, can be very helpful with complicated grief. Learning your triggers. And it's important to learn your triggers. To do with grief, you don't want to be triggered around anniversaries and times like that. But your triggers are not just things that are there for you to avoid. You don't just learn your triggers so you can avoid them. We also learn our triggers so that we know where more work needs to be done. So if we're constantly being triggered by the same thing, it's usually a sign for us to look at that and maybe do a bit more work in that area. Whether the grief is through losing a loved one or a relationship, don't avoid things we enjoy, because it's very easy to just disconnect and feel guilty about enjoying yourself or smiling or spending. But it's important that we don't avoid things we enjoy, because these are the things that help to reconnect us and to the healing process. So slowly reconnect with people. So whether that's through bereavement, loss of a relationship. So if you've come out of a long-term relationship and you've been grieving for this relationship for 2 years now, maybe, and you're going through complicated grief, to slowly start reconnecting with people. And that might look like dating or setting up a profile. If you've lost a loved one, it might mean going back to the dance class that you used to go to for your social interaction, not feeling guilty about that, slowly reconnecting with people, because that's very important in the healing process. And journaling, and this is a big one. This is also very closely linked with my special guest, Rachel, that's coming up on as the guest for the segment that I'm doing on complex grief. She really is the expert on this piece, and she used journaling just as a way at the time of just chronicling her own feelings and trying to learn her own triggers about her own complex grief. But that turned into a book, and she'll speak about that on the next podcast, how her journal became a book. If you're struggling particularly with complex grief due to the loss of a loved one or a child, support groups and peer support will be very helpful to you. Simply just having people around you that have gone through similar experiences can be very useful. Also, you can access therapy. So you have special bereavement counsellors if your issue is the death of a loved one, but you also have a range of different counsellors, so psychodynamic counsellors that kind of look into your past. I'm an integrative counsellor that combines psychodynamic with other modes of therapy to give a more tailored approach to therapy. So we can look at the past and look at if there's things in the past that have made this process of complicated grief more apparent for you, because there are usually things in your past that kind of connect to how you are in the present. If we're supporting others, and we'll stay on death for the moment, it's important that we acknowledge loss. We don't avoid contact with the person. So if we message them or we put a card through the door and we don't hear anything, it's important to try again tomorrow, because they'll be taking it each day at a time, like I said before. So each day will be a new day and a new opportunity where they might want to reconnect. So don't take a no yesterday as a no today. Give them space if asked. If you feel like, especially like me, I'm someone that fusses, so I'd probably fuss around. Don't take it personal if they're saying that they need space. It's not a reflection on you. It's just them expressing what they need at that time. Don't be afraid to talk about the person, or if it's a pet, don't be afraid to talk about the person or pet who died, because that's something that we tend to avoid. It's very similar to suicide. We feel like if we speak about it, we're making it more painful or making it more likely to happen, you know? What people that are going through complicated grief actually want to do is talk about their feelings about their loved one, whether that's through losing them to death or anything else. They want to talk. It's important that when you're listening, you focus on that person. So if they're bereaved or they're talking about a relationship that was particularly a painful breakup or something, that you separate from your own feelings. It can get a bit tedious if you know, someone that you love is constantly talking about the same thing over and over, but you don't want them to sense that frustration. I feel like they can't speak to you. You have to constantly separate from your own feelings. Help them get extra support if needed, because that's what help is for. Help is not because you're weak. It's to help you stay strong. So guide them towards extra support and support them where you can. If it's not just death and it's how you deal with loss and endings, it's important that you explore your own relationship with endings. Look into your past and how your parents taught you how to deal with loss. Look at where you need to do the work. Build confidence that you're able to leave situations, that you're not clinging on and looking at ending as a negative thing. Because like I say, it can be the start of a new beginning. So being confident enough to walk away and to end the situation. So if you're someone that avoids situations or you distance yourself, just being aware that's what you do. So knowing in yourself what your own relationship with is, and then learning your patterns of behavior. So, do the work. If you avoid situations and that's not something that you want to do, learn to be more vulnerable. If you struggle to leave, build confidence so that it doesn't feel impossible for you to walk away. If it's, once again, give yourself permission to grieve, because it's not just death that we grieve for. We grieve for lost relationships and loss of friendships and all of the other things that I described previously. We may crave that home that we used to live in, or that country that used to be where we called home. Grief is the price of loving something. So don't be so hard on yourself. Give yourself permission to grieve. And also just redefine what endings mean for you, because I think a lot of people tend to look at endings as something negative. If you ask the majority of people what ending means, they immediately go, oh, it's that sense of trepidation. Something's ending. So therefore I've done something bad or someone's to blame. Endings can be a transition to a beautiful new beginning. So it's just by simply reframing how you look at endings and start looking at life as new beginnings, because that's what each day is an opportunity to do, to have a new beginning. So sometimes things have to end for something else to materialize, but it doesn't have to be a bad thing. And complicated grief is something that is difficult to navigate, but simply being aware that you have complicated grief is the first step in getting better and healing and starting that process. So hopefully this has helped. Next up on the podcast, we will have the extended interview with Rachel. And I hope you guys take something away from that, because she really is the expert when it comes to complicated grief. I can't compare anything to the loss of a child. So I'm totally grateful to her for agreeing to do it. And that will be up next on the podcast. So I hope you've taken away today something from complicated grief. I hope you now know how it differs from depression, the relationship between endings and complicated grief, just the different type of endings that we have in life. Even though medically speaking, they say 6 months, I think that is a small amount of time to still be grieving something that you love so much. I don't think we should ever put a time limit on grief. I also think that we should also remember that we're here to live and we do have a future. So just by simply being able to look forward to the future, that may be as far as we can get with complicated grief. Maybe we'll never get to that acceptance, but it's just maybe having more good days than bad days. I'll speak to you guys soon. I hope you've taken something away, and be back real soon.